Okay, today is Tuesday, July 31st. So we've had an exciting week. We wanted to talk about a few of the recent partnerships that have happened. We've seen a partnership with BZX and MakerDAO. So BZX has allowed some cool major areas of potential integration of using DAI as a unit of account for margin traders, using BZX to create a secondary market for DAI, and also using the BZXI tokens to collateralize CDPs and offset stability fees. And I'm just going along the agenda, so if you guys want to check out the links to any of this, that's fantastic as well. Also, Swarm Fund has partnered with MakerDAO to bring the DAI token to their platform, which is definitely really cool, exciting partnership for us. And lastly, we've seen that an Ethereum alarm clock dApp that now schedules DAI token natively. So you can test this out on the Koban testnet. In terms of recent events, we had a great experience at DappCon Berlin, it seems. Matt gave a phenomenal talk that you can actually go ahead and check out the recording for. And Nick had a sweatshirt stolen because Maker is so highly popular. And Distributed SF, Stephen Becker, our head of risk, did a phenomenal job on a panel in which he talked about opportunities for the underserved and how it is that Maker is creating some of those opportunities with projects like Bifrost, as well as the 20% principle. In terms of upcoming ETH events, from August 3rd to 4th, we're going to be at DisCon, which is a cool conference in Boulder, Colorado. So Ethan will be giving a workshop. I'll be giving a bit of an overview of Maker to those that haven't yet experienced the magic. And then following that, August 10th to 12th is ETH India in Bangalore, where we're going to officially launch the Maker JavaScript library and interact with some hackers there and see what they can create. And then ETH Berlin is happening in September. So please feel free to apply to hack there and work on some Maker bounties. But that's about what I have going on in my world. Rich, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. I want to talk about some things that are happening on my world, which is the online world. I'm going to keep talking about this in each one of our meetings, but here's our fourth or fifth reminder. We're having a series of meetings throughout the week, and it's important that people join if they have any interest at all in the inner workings of Maker and the direction that we're taking in the future, some of our major initiatives that affect the foundation itself. So on, excuse me, rude. So on Tuesdays, we're having these general catch-up meetings, talking about what's going on, what will be going on. On Wednesdays, we're having a series of recurring meetings with Rune Christensen, where we discuss issues related directly to the foundation, the operation of the Maker Foundation, and charitable giving, issues like that. On Thursdays, we are doing a very interesting deep dive into scientific governance and the risk framework, which sounds a bit dry, but it's highly recommended that if you're interested in how the DAO is going to form, how governance is going to work, how asset types will be added, and some really interesting issues about plutocracies and how to deal with voter apathy, and from a high level all the way to low level stuff like how does a vote actually work. If you're interested in any of that, definitely show up on our Thursday meetings. Speaking of Thursday meetings, we recently announced a stability fee raise, which has generated a great deal of conversation in the community, which is great. I've posted an FAQ to our subreddit that is a recap and sort of a condensation of all the back and forth that we've had and all the questions that have been asked. There's still a lot of ground to go over. So on this Thursday, we'll be having a special themed version of the scientific governance meeting that will be dedicated specifically to stability fee, its implications, why it happened, how we're going to implement it, I'm looking forward to that. We're going to have a series of special guests. So Rune will be there. Stephen Becker will be there, of course. We're going to have Lev. He's one of our econ geniuses, will be there in attendance. And Greg DePrisco, who's from our business development unit, but also has a keen financial mind, and and a degree to show for it. So we're going to have a lot of heavyweights there to discuss the stability fee. So if you have any questions or comments, and you want to speak to some of the architects of the change, please show up on Thursday, and we'll dig into it. Some other interesting things come from the community this week as well. We have a lot of people generating content for us, which is great. So Greg DePrisco, I just mentioned, our business development head. He's also the writer of a document that is referred to, I think, more than any other in our ecosystem, which is the original Maker for Dummies blog post, which is what, long before I was hired at Maker, I stumbled on something called a CDP in a subreddit somewhere, wanted to know what it was, Googled what is MakerDAO, and I ended up at the Maker for Dummies blog post. And Greg is sort of responsible for me getting my first CDP and potentially my entire career. So I owe it all to Greg in his article. But that's a long-winded introduction to his most recent post, which is Maker for Dummies Part 2, where he goes into some of the conceptual reasons why MakerDAO and CDPs and DAI are all pretty big deals, and it's one of the few articles that I've read that actually encapsulates all the value propositions into one easy to digest article. So I highly recommend people read that. There'll be a link in the description below when we post this to YouTube, so please check it out. Just mentioned that Swarm has elected to use DAI, which is cool, but I think it's especially cool because it's an example of I think the first organization that I'm aware of that had plans for its own stablecoin at launch, and sort of came around to the idea that that's harder than it might initially look, and they chose to adopt DAI, which I think is a fairly big win for us. Swarm is worth doing some research about. They're doing some really interesting things with securities and tokenization, but the confidence level that they showed they had in us to adopt DAI, I think, is a huge win for us. Also from the community this week, user tbone, I don't know what his real name is, posted an image and is about to upload some code that shows what the gini coefficient is for the Maker token. And I had to check Wikipedia to find out what that meant. But it's a really interesting way of looking at the dispersal of wealth through an economy, which works just as well with the allocation of tokens in a crypto economy. And he's doing some interesting work that shows how many people are holding and how much those people have. And this is interesting to me because it ties into another conversation we've been having in the governance meetings, where we talk about a range of issues, but not the least of which is, are we under threat of an emerging plutocracy, and how do we keep track of winners and losers in the system, and how do we determine what it takes to pass a successful vote, and coming up with code that determines who's holding Maker tokens and how many tokens they possess is a really great step to get there. So I wanted to give a shout out to tbone for doing that. He's going to post that to GitHub soon. They'll be providing a link to people that want to use that Python script for themselves. I think that's it for me, Jess, as far as random events in the online world go.
Yeah, that's great. Cool. Well, now let's talk to some of our super special guests. So we have Brian Avelo, who is a new hire for the legal team. I'm going to ask Brian a few softball questions in terms of describing himself. And he's going to take it over to hardball. So Brian, do you want to tell us a bit about what your new role is? Go ahead and No?
Yeah, Brian, I think you're muted right now. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
Perfect.
So, where to start? I joined the team about 3 weeks ago now. I've taken over the general counsel position. I'm working alongside Jacek, who's our European-based attorney, and Chris Padovano, our legal advisor here in New York. My background, before starting with Maker, I've worked, as an attorney in the blockchain space for about the last 2.5 years, since January 2016. I started working with DAP which is the R&D team that architected, along with Rune, and built the MakerDAO system. I've worked with DAP now for about 2.5 years, essentially as kind of an outsourced in-house counsel, working with a lot of their corporate structuring issues, employment, some trademark, some IP-related work. And my role with DAP nicely tailed into working with a lot of other very early stage companies, some of which you've probably heard at this point. Like, for example, I've worked with Steemit. I've worked with some of the investors behind projects like Augur and some other projects in the space. Really kind of a diverse practice. I think, my role here at Maker is really helping the organization evolve, legally speaking, from a startup that, was less than probably 2.5, 3 years ago, was a handful of individuals, to what it is today, which is an entity that employs, or a series of entities that employ, over 70 people spread across the world. And it's a matter of, from my perspective, getting all of these kind of, I don't want to say disparate parts, but all of these incredibly dynamic parts working together well and seamlessly. And, for me, it's very exciting because it's the opportunity to kind of see the next stage of MakerDAO evolve. And I've followed the project very closely. Even though I didn't work with Maker previously, I knew a lot of the very early stakeholders very early on. So it's gratifying, both professionally and personally, to kind of see how this thing has evolved, and to be, invited on and have the honor of taking part in kind of the next stage in that growth.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And we're incredibly excited to have you there with us.
Actually, I'm going to jump in with some of the
Sure.
hardballs, actually.
Please.
So the law fascinates me from the outside. I don't think I'd be able to do it from the inside, but from the outside, it's fascinating endlessly. Do you think there's any specific challenges with being legal counsel for somebody in the blockchain space as opposed to a traditional software company?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
without a doubt. Without a doubt. I mean, just talking about at a very general kind of 10,000 foot level, especially over the last year, what's been the main issue confronting startups in the blockchain space? Token sales, ICOs, dealing with an ever-changing kind of securities regulatory environment, an uncertain, until fairly recently, regulatory environment here in the United States, how to deal with all the tax issues that come about with whether you're doing token sales based in the United States, whether you're doing token sales overseas, where your buyers necessarily sit. I mean, just on the securities standpoint, it's been very challenging, like I said, up until the last few months, to have any sort of better said than any sort of regulatory clarity, but a firm regulatory footing to place yourself on. So when you are acting the way your business wants to act, you're not always looking over your shoulder as to what could the consequences of those actions be. Right.
Yeah,
So
I guess that was kind of my question. Is there, do you feel like you're sort of stumbling around in the dark a lot of the time, or do you feel like there is some clear direction that we can take in this space now?
Well, I don't think we're stumbling around in the dark, and we being just players in the space in general. I think at least on the U.S. side, and even increasingly from other international jurisdictions, you're looking at some of the certain jurisdictions, the Maltas, the Caymans, the Hong Kongs, the Singapores, Japan to a large extent, are starting to provide the regulatory clarity in which these businesses can begin to function and continue to function, I think, over the next 5 years. And I think even though the SEC, the CFTC, and the general U.S. regulatory environment tends to get heavily criticized by players in the space. And I'm not absolving New York at any level. I think New York is its own special case because of the bit license, but that's a different conversation. I think there have been a lot of positive moves to encourage innovation as much as possible here in the States, even though it hasn't been as quickly moving or as concrete as we would like to see.
Do you
But
find that that's the general sense in the space or in the regulatory space, that they don't want to poison the well, that they have this understanding that this could be, the next Silicon Valley, and they don't want to ruin it?
I think it's more of a matter of they don't understand it and they're in the process of getting educated. And the people that work in the regulatory agencies, the SEC, the CFTC, what have you, are, I think, personality types are risk adverse, right? So they tend to be more methodical approaching how to regulate or to deal with a growing industry. And it's a matter of people like ourselves in the community, putting out educational pieces, educating the regulators as to the positive attributes of what this sector is growing into and what it can become, or what it's already become and will become in the next 3 to 5 years. And I think you look at like I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead, Rich.
Oh, so you just said something that was interesting to me. So
Sure.
Do you feel that self-regulation is a worthwhile endeavor in this space, or is that largely virtue signaling, or does that really have an impact?
No, I think it can have an impact, right? It has to be. You could have an SRO that, if you get buy-in from a regulatory agency, the ones that matter, the SEC, the CFTC, perhaps the FTC, I think it could, you could have an SRO which basically could put out frameworks that could easily be adopted by regulatory agencies, and that would give larger players in this space a real voice in crafting the regulations that could be presented and eventually be adopted. And I think you're already kind of seeing that come out. I mean, I know that people on this phone call follow regulatory developments closely. And there's been a lot of news about a group of Silicon Valley investors in conjunction with some of the larger law firms that were, I don't want to say pioneers, but certainly the people that were leading the charge with ICOs and with the SAF, the Simple Agreement for Future Tokens document that came out during the Filecoin token sale, as far as starting a dialogue and doing their part educating the SEC. And I think what you've seen from the SEC thus far is that intentional campaign of education is having positive effects into how they are perceiving the market. I mean, you saw Commissioner Hinman made some comments about, not only about Ether not being a security, but laying out a roadmap for how organizations, platforms could be sufficiently decentralized so as to have their tokens not be considered securities. And I think we talk about signaling. I think that is strong signaling from the SEC as to how, whether it's Filecoin or whether it's our chain or what have you, how they could function in a way where they could stay on top of and in a good position with regards to the law. So I think that in that sense, it's actually been like, you've seen these kind of self-organizing groups mature already over the last year and a half and start to make real impact at least in the United States, at the regulatory level.
Do you find that the U.S. Leads by example in the regulatory space, or are they sort of playing a wait and see game with the rest of the world to see what works elsewhere?
That's a good question. And that's a good question. I think the U.S. and these are only my personal feelings. I'll just preface it. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Maker legal department. Maybe Jacek would have a different kind of thoughts on this, or Chris. But I think the U.S. is cautious, but we don't necessarily look to, we don't look to one other country. We don't look at Japan or Australia or France as kind of the torchbearer that which we will follow. I think the U.S. tends to see itself as, well, we'll methodically consider the landscape, then we will take a position, and then other countries that tend to look to our Securities and Exchange Commission for kind of a regulatory roadmap will follow, right? So I'm speaking about, I've in my past life, I did a lot of work in Latin America, and at least with countries like, for example, Brazil, to a certain extent, Argentina, you see in Brazil, for example, you'll see the regulatory agency, the CVM, which is their equivalent of the SEC, will closely hew regulatory developments along the lines of what the SEC does. And I think if we make this example right, if the US gets it right, it can be very beneficial for other countries to easily adopt kind of our approach to things. And I'm not saying that in a xenophobic or nationalistic sort of way, but it's just, the US does tend, the US tends to be a trendsetter for how regulatory platforms are necessarily adopted.
Yeah, there's so much to dig into here. It's insanely complex.
It's true.
Sort of this two competing motivations of not wanting to miss the blockchain boat, but also not wanting to destabilize an economy and not wanting to sort of go counter to 50 or 60 years of regulatory history suddenly.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
So I know that this is probably going to be a hard question to answer.
Sure,
I'm going to throw it at you anyways. What are you up to legally with Maker right now that might be interesting to talk about?
That I can talk about. I can tell you this: we're working on, from like I was kind of alluding to, operationally, we're getting the company, or getting the organization to really function like a well-oiled machine, a well-oiled startup, as opposed to but as an organization that is evolving, right? Going from being a toddler 2 or 3 years ago to being, a full-grown adult, or at least on the way to being a full-grown adult. And that, in and of itself, at least from the legal department, there's a lot of not the sexiest work in some respects, right? And we're not talking about interfacing with regulatory agencies or kind of high-level questions about securities or commodities or what have you, but making sure the business kind of functions in a way where it can really continue to grow at the clip it's growing, while also presenting itself well to the public and potentially to other stakeholders in the space. I think to talk more about what I find personally very interesting, Maker, just all the different deals that we're entering into. Obviously the trade shift. These are things that our business development team has done an incredible job making these relationships and really selling, pushing for not only adoption of DAI, but the education about DAI and the Maker system, in addition to the work that on the governance side and on the risk side, really getting into the technical weeds about educating all the different stakeholders in the space. So from the legal perspective, it's, I'm kind of sitting behind all these different developments, making sure that, what we're putting out to the public is correct. It's not risky. And in addition to that, there's all of the kind of complications that one would expect in a startup of, a rapidly growing startup of 75, international based employees. So sorry for the long-winded answer. I hope that covers what you're thinking, Rich.
No, that's great. I think that we knew what we were getting into when we invited Delaware in. So.
Very true, right?
Does anybody in the community, anybody on the call, have any questions that we can ask Brian while he's in?
Sure.
It's not a large crowd today, so we might not come up with anything. All right, I think that answered some of my questions. I kind of feel like it would be nice to have a legal specific meeting at some point, because there's a lot of really cool, really interesting things happening here.
I can tell you, even before I started working with Maker, I've been working with DAPHub for a long time and some other companies in the space. And I think that one of the trends that we're talking about, kind of academic interests, one of the trends I'm seeing in blockchain is this, the embrace of older, quote unquote, types of corporate forms or company forms, and for lack of a better term, rejigging them to work with blockchain distributed decentralized teams and platforms. I think one of the things that, if we're talking about trends, one of the things I think you'll see in the very near future is blockchain-based distributed teams, platforms, DAOs adopting cooperatives as their government-facing entity, because these are member-managed, democratically governed, government-sanctioned entities through which you can have, distributions, even distributions of dividends, even distributions of payments through different members in an organization that's organized hierarchically and run by the members. So there's already been a little bit of writing about this. You'll see something that I probably will publish in the next few days about just cooperatives in general and one specific type of cooperative, the Limited Cooperative Association. But that's something for anyone that has an interest in the legal side of the space on how the legal landscape is evolving. I think the use of cooperatives, specifically here in the United States and also overseas, for how the teams will start organizing themselves in the very near future.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. The first time I got into this space relatively late. I'm not like everybody else who somehow discovered Bitcoin the minute the white paper was launched. But the first time that somebody described a DAO to me, I interrupted them and said, "Oh, you mean a co-op?"
Yeah, exactly.
And I
exactly.
explained what a co-op was for them. So this is obvious.
It fits so naturally with how a lot of these teams function. Really, it really, really does. And I think, at least in the United States, when you hear the word co-op, you think, okay, well, it's either a grain silo owned by a number of farmers, or it's your local grocery store. People are, you don't want to say ignorant, but they're not it's not well known how pervasive the use of cooperatives is really in our economy. There's a lot of different large organizations that function as cooperatives, and they still fly under the radar. But I think that the form itself is very well suited to the blockchain space, especially distributed teams, in which there's not one leader or one kind of figurehead to run, an entity or organization.
It also opens the door to a legal method of distributing dividends, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it does. It does. It's not only distributing dividends, potentially distributing tokens, potentially doing, and I'm actually, the article I'm about to publish on this it kind of touches on this point too, but potentially doing token distributions, token sales could be interesting.
Yeah, if the token
interesting way of doing it.
A share in the cooperative, then the legal framework already exists, right?
Yeah, the way it's interesting, the way that the traditional way that you earn in a cooperative is by the provision of services. So, for example, imagine if Uber as a platform was organized as a cooperative, right? I, as a driver, drive 40 hours a week, 80 hours a week. I'm not only going to be paid you can be paid some salary, and then you can be paid basically a dividend for the services that you provide to the co-op, right? So I could potentially earn quite a bit more, and at that same point, also have a voice in governing the platform itself. I think from a worker perspective, it's a much more it is a much more balanced way of living your life vis-a-vis the entity through which you work. So,
especially if it's true that we are sort of globally moving towards a gig economy, then this might be a way to push back on that.
Yeah, it's 100% right. 100% right, Rich.
Jess, did we get a question?
Yes, so we have a question from the community, actually, sure. Brian. Jordan asks, so the Maker Foundation will be a co-op legally in the United States?
No, but we haven't, I'm comfortable in telling you that we haven't discussed the Maker Foundation as a cooperative. I'm just talking about cooperatives in generally, and I've worked with other companies in the blockchain space that are organized and or organizing as cooperatives, but at present, no, we don't have any discussion about having a cooperative for Maker, at least.
All right, I think that we could probably wrap it up there, Brian, unless there was something else that you specifically wanted to talk about in the meeting.
No, I appreciate everyone's time, and look forward to hopefully speaking.
Hey guys, looks like one more question. There's a clarification came in on the same question.
Sure.
Yeah. So Jordan is wondering, is there a specific reason that it wouldn't be, or just that we're still figuring it out?
It's the latter. I think it's still kind of an ongoing discussion. But there's no, I mean, no, I think, I mean, I personally, not speaking for anyone, you know, not speaking for anyone at the team, I like the cooperative form. I think it functions well. But it's something that we, you know, we still are just kind of discussing internally.
All right, that's amazing. So yeah, that's a lot to think about. That's very cool. Jess, I don't know if Stephen's going to be able to make the meeting today, so, and it doesn't look like we have any more questions from the community, so this could be a point we can stick a pin in this one.
Yeah, I think we're okay. That was absolutely fantastic, Brian. Thank you so much for all of that. We'll have to have you on more of these. And
You're very kind, Jess. Thanks everyone for your time. I appreciate it. Thanks for listening. It was interesting. Always around to chat about any legal issues in the blockchain space. It's kind of what I've devoted my career to. So it's very gratifying to do so.
Cool. We'll definitely have you back. All right, I think that's it. So thanks everyone for joining the meeting. I'll be posting this to YouTube presently, and I'll put a link in the subreddit and in our chat if you guys want to see how or refer back to anything that happened in the meeting. All right, thanks.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.